Religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, good people would do good things, and evil people would do evil things. But for good people to do evil things, it takes religion. A brutal quote by Christopher Hitchens, striking directly at the heart of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. His ruthless reflection might simply be too hard for some to bear until the end. Because when the system of beliefs that one has trusted for years starts to collapse, what's left? It might feel easier to keep your eyes closed, to keep handing everything over to a higher power, to take refuge in prayer and guilt, as if kneeling and bowing your head could somehow redeem the worst. And perhaps this is the most rotten core of religion, the idea that believing also means giving up true responsibility. After all, there's God. He'll take care of it. He'll judge, save, punish. But this, according to Christopher Hitchens, is the real tragedy. Handing over one's conscience and life to fairy tales written by men and manipulated by others, many of whom are disturbingly similar to the same men so feared and hated today. And to those who believe religion also offers something beautiful. Get ready to hear what Christopher has to say about that. He was a journalist, essayist, literary critic, and political commentator. Born in 1949 in Portsmouth, UK, he later became a US citizen. He studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Balliol College, Oxford, and began his career writing for various magazines. In the 1980s, he moved to the United States and wrote for major publications, eventually becoming one of the most influential voices of the new atheism movement, alongside Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. Famous for his sharp wit and intellectual rigor, he authored dozens of books and articles. His most controversial work is perhaps God is Not Great: How Religion Poisons Everything, a global manifesto against organized religion. Christopher Hitchens died on December 15, 2011 in Houston, Texas, from esophageal cancer. The diagnosis came a year earlier, and despite treatment, the disease progressed rapidly. Until the very end, he continued writing and speaking publicly, rejecting every religious consolation. His death marked the loss of one of the clearest, most provocative, and relentless voices in modern critical thought. He was not just an atheist, he was a destroyer of certainties, someone who had the courage to point his finger at what many consider sacred and untouchable: faith. There's no hatred in his attack, only disillusionment. No blind rage, but sharp, focused clarity. According to Hitchens, religions are not instruments of peace, but weapons of control. They don't elevate humanity, they imprison it. And the target isn't just a belief or a dogma. The real target is the mechanism that turns faith into a justification for cruelty. Christianity, Islam, Judaism. 3 faiths, 3 sacred books, 3 prophets. But for Hitchens, only one problem: the absolute conviction of holding the ultimate truth. And when someone believes they have the truth in their pocket, anything becomes justifiable, even evil. We'll now explore one by one his direct attacks on the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah. No mercy, no diplomacy, just raw reality and razor-sharp logic. Perhaps exactly what's needed to move one step further in our evolution as a species in the universe. Starting with Christianity, Hitchens goes straight for the core of its doctrine, the figure of Jesus, and the book that tells his story, the Bible. He calls it a book full of contradictions, written by fallible men, altered over time, and used to justify crimes in the name of God. He doesn't just question miracles or dogma. He exposes what he sees as a fundamental paradox. If Jesus is God, then he's the same God of the Old Testament, the one who ordered genocides, let children die, rewarded vengeance. In his view, you can't save the figure of Christ by detaching him from that legacy. Every verse promising love is paired with one that incites fear. Every call for forgiveness is followed by eternal damnation. Why would a loving God torture his own creations for eternity just because they didn't believe, he asks. And the specter of hell, to him, is nothing more than a primitive form of social control. In his critique of Christianity, he also dismantles the very idea of divine sacrifice. What's moral about killing your own son to atone for someone else's sin? That's a cruel fable, not an act of love. He accuses believers of being willing to accept any absurdity as long as it's labeled faith. In doing so, religion always absolves itself. If something happens, it's God's will. If it doesn't, it's still part of a mysterious divine plan. Logic is sidestepped. Reason is sacrificed. Religion is the wish to be a slave, the idea that there's an invisible master watching every thought, every gesture, even the most intimate ones. And when he turns to Islam, the tone grows even harsher. He describes the Quran as a book devoid of poetry, repetitive, obsessed with obedience and punishment. In his view, Muhammad wasn't a prophet, but a political and military leader who declared himself God's messenger to legitimize his power. If someone believes the Quran was dictated directly by God, then they must accept that God is deeply obsessed with human submission. And that is the core of the critique. Religion, especially Islam, demands absolute submission. There is no room for doubt, no space for interpretation. Only religion, he says, can make a perfectly sane person blow themselves up along with others, believing they're headed to paradise. Hitchens points out that Islam today shows its most virulent forms in jihadist extremism. He calls it the modern face of medieval hatred, an ideological system that has turned the idea of God into a weapon, fueling wars, persecution, and terror. And without falling into simplistic generalizations, he urges people not to close their eyes to this growing fanaticism, fueled precisely by the untouchable sanctity of the text. Religion has the power to justify the unjustifiable. That's what makes it dangerous. Then comes the most complex and provocative part, his critique of Judaism, delivered with even greater subtlety. He considers it the root from which the other two major monotheistic religions developed, carrying with them the notion of a jealous, vengeful God obsessively interested in the sexual behavior of his followers. According to Hitchens, the Torah is a collection of tribal laws, many of them cruel, outdated, and deeply patriarchal. Would a universal God really have spoken only once in history, to a single people, in a remote desert in the Middle East, leaving behind such a confusing, contradictory, and violent code? But the harshest blow comes when he addresses the idea of the chosen people. To him, this belief has fed a sense of superiority that, throughout history, has often clashed with other peoples and cultures. In its most nationalist and identity-based form, Judaism becomes the seed of a dangerous exclusivity. Being God's chosen people is one of the most dangerous ideas ever conceived by mankind. He adds that this belief has helped justify injustices, such as, in the case of political Zionism, building an agricultural nation for Jews on Arab land is a foolish, messianic idea. It created a permanent conflict and turned an admirable people of thinkers into a people armed for war. But Hitchens doesn't stop there. For him, faith is not a support, but a surrender. It's not comfort, it's submission. Because when doubt, responsibility, and individual freedom are abandoned, people become tools in the hands of others: priests, imams, rabbis, prophets. In every religion, the same pattern is found. The belief that the universe was made for humans, that suffering has a higher purpose, and that death is not the end, but a transition. All of this, he says, is nothing more than a comforting story, a fairy tale for adults unable to face the raw, real beauty and absurdity of existence. And while scientific discoveries open new horizons, religion keeps people chained to primitive, violent, dogmatic myths. There is nothing that religion can explain that science can't explain better. And there is no good deed a believer can do that an atheist couldn't also perform. The point isn't just what one believes, but what one is willing to do in the name of that belief. And history, for Hitchens, is filled with atrocities committed by people convinced they were carrying out the will of God. From the Inquisition to the Crusades, from suicide bombings to genocides, from genital mutilation to Sharia courts, everything has passed through the narrow gate of faith. That's why he insists that religion is not simply wrong, but dangerous. Christopher Hitchens answered firmly whenever someone claimed religion could have some positive effects. In his view, religion is not required to act morally or nobly. In one of his most famous statements, he declared, "Name me one ethical action performed or one moral statement made by a believer that could not be made or performed by a non-believer. You won't be able to." He argued that goodness and morality don't come from religion. They precede it. And even though religion often disguises itself with promises of comfort or charity, it has historically acted with barbarity whenever it held power. So, what did one of the fiercest critics of organized faith propose as a solution? Surprisingly, he didn't call for bans or persecution. He didn't suggest religion should be suppressed or outlawed. Instead, he simply asked that it be treated like any other human idea, tested, debated, even ridiculed when appropriate, and forced to justify itself publicly. Respect is not an automatic right. It must be earned. And so far, religion has not earned it. Because in the end, faith, to him, is just a massive, unproven hypothesis, a collective consolation that keeps people company, but also keeps them in chains. It might make people feel less alone, but also less free. And perhaps he was right when he said, religious faith is ineradicable, precisely because we are still evolving as creatures. If that's true, then those who live today without kneeling before an altar, without entrusting their fears and lives to a deity, might not be colder or more cynical. They might simply be further along, a step ahead in the cultural and spiritual evolution of the human species. From this perspective, the non-believer no longer appears to be lacking something, but rather someone who has crossed a threshold, anticipating what may become the norm in generations to come. Those same generations, more evolved than we are now, may one day file religion away in the drawer of history, next to other primitive phases of humanity, seeing us as unaware victims of a world still trapped in fear, superstition, and outdated thinking. So how many more atrocities must take place before we truly realize that God has nothing to do with these dogmas and rituals? And if these ideas once helped get us this far, isn't it time to let them go and continue forward without the weight of ancient, obsolete illusions?